Ma'am, leave the motor pool immediately. This is not a place for civilians or military dependents. The words came cold and decisive without a second of hesitation. Colonel Robert Kane didn't ask who she was. He didn't request identification. He didn't bother to verify anything. He simply issued an order, as if the person standing in front of him wasn't a human being, but an error that needed to be removed. The woman standing before the line of military vehicles didn't move. She didn't react. She didn't explain. She didn't apologize. Kane looked at her once more, then smirked. "You're in the wrong place. Probably someone's wife from this unit. Just wandered in." A casual sentence, yet enough to erase her human worth in just a few words. A few quiet chuckles rose from behind him. Not out of cruelty. Just habit what happens when someone who looks powerless is seen standing where they don't belong. The woman remained silent. Not a weak silence, but the silence of someone long accustomed to being underestimated. Kane lost his patience. "Don't waste my time. Leave. Now." The air around them grew heavy. The laughter faded. Something felt wrong, though no one yet understood what it was. The woman's name was Evelyn Hart, and in just a few minutes, everyone in that motor pool would realize something they had forgotten. That some people don't need to wear a uniform to carry an entire lifetime of service with them. If you believe that true courage doesn't live in the sound of gunfire, but in the silence of those who have walked through war, subscribe to veterans' legacy stories, so together we can preserve the memory, dignity, and reverence owed to our quiet heroes. Evelyn didn't respond. She stood still, her back straight, her gaze neither avoiding nor challenging. Just a calm look, as if the words spoken moments ago weren't strong enough to reach the deepest part of her. That silence wasn't confusion. It wasn't fear. It was the silence of someone who had learned not to react to careless judgments. Evelyn's right hand tightened slightly around the keys to her rental car. Cold metal pressed into her palm. She didn't look down. The small movement wasn't meant to reassure anyone but herself. An old habit formed during years when staying calm was sometimes the thin line between control and chaos. The keys clicked softly, then went still. Colonel Kane watched her reaction, or rather the lack of one, and interpreted it the way power often does. In his mind, that silence could only mean ignorance. He assumed she wasn't speaking because she didn't know what to say, because she'd been cornered, because she'd realized she didn't belong there. Kane curled his lip and spoke firmly. "Didn't you hear me? This is a restricted area." Evelyn still didn't answer. Her eyes moved across the line of vehicles, across the faces watching, then returned to Kane. No asking permission. No pleading. No resistance. That composure unsettled Kane more than any argument could have. He was used to his authority producing immediate reactions, fear compliance, or at the very least, an explanation. Here he got nothing. Kane turned his head, his voice rising a notch as if to reclaim control. "Miller." A young lieutenant stepped forward. Miller was still new, his posture straight but uncertainty clear in his eyes. "Yes, sir." "Escort her out," Kane said decisively. "Explain the regulations to her." Miller took a slow step forward. He looked at Evelyn, then back at Kane, trying to balance the order with the vague sense that something hadn't been verified. "Ma'am," he said more gently, "please come with me." Evelyn turned to Miller. Her gaze didn't stop him, but it held him long enough to make him pause for half a second. There was no reproach, no plea, just a strange calm, as if she were giving him time to do the right thing. Miller swallowed hard. He knew the procedure. He knew verification came first. But standing before him now, authority was speaking in a different voice. Evelyn didn't move, not in defiance, but because she was used to being asked to leave based solely on appearances. She had stood in rooms where life and death decisions were made in seconds. And she had stood in hallways where rank went unseen if it wasn't stitched onto a uniform. Her silence carried memories of past dismissals, not loud, not bitter, just deeply settled. She knew there were moments when speaking wouldn't change anything. Only timing could. Kane crossed his arms, interpreting Miller's hesitation as indecision. "Escort her out," he repeated slower this time, emphasizing each word. Miller nodded, but his feet didn't move. The stillness stretched on, and in that pause, a few eyes around them began to shift. No more laughter. No more indifference. Just a quiet, uneasy waiting, as if someone had realized things were going too far. Evelyn took a soft breath in. No one noticed. She held her posture, the keys resting in her hand, her gaze steady. Her silence wasn't empty. It had weight. and that weight began to slow the familiar reflexes of power. When silence lasts long enough to make people uneasy, the next words spoken are no longer reminders, they become public humiliation. Kane laughed. Not loudly, not harshly, but with a dry chuckle, as if he had just heard something too naive to be taken seriously. Readiness, he repeated lightly, stressing the word like a joke. You came here to inspect my readiness. Evelyn met his gaze. Her voice remained even, neither raised nor lowered. I need to review the vehicle maintenance logs, outstanding parts requisitions, and the deadline reports from the past 90 days. Those words landed in the motor pool like foreign objects. Too precise, too on point. And for that very reason, they grated on Kane. He shook his head, his smile thinning. Listen, Kane said, his tone carrying a trace of feigned patience. This isn't a classroom or a guided tour. This unit's records are controlled documents. No one simply walks in and demands to see them. Then he tilted his head, his eyes sweeping Evelyn from head to toe. Who do you think you're talking to? A few laughs rose from behind him. Soft, brief. No one stepped forward, but no one spoke up to stop it either. It was the kind of laughter that appears when people believe they're standing on the right side and the person in front of them doesn't deserve respect. Evelyn heard it. She didn't turn around. Maintenance, requisition, deadline. Kane repeated, separating each word. Those aren't for outsiders. He paused, then continued more clearly so everyone could hear. And you are an outsider. The air around them shifted. Silence became a choice. Those standing nearby heard every word. A few people bent back to their work as if that might excuse them from participating. The humiliation didn't come from one man. It came from a collective that agreed to remain silent. Evelyn didn't interrupt. She didn't emphasize. She didn't defend herself. She stood still, letting the words pass over her, as she had let so many others pass before. She understood this feeling. When your truth hasn't reached its moment to be heard, every explanation only convinces others that you're making excuses. Kane stepped forward. I'll say this one last time, he said, his voice stripped of its earlier courtesy. This conversation is over. He turned to Miller, no longer looking at Evelyn. Escort her out. The order was clear, official, no longer a suggestion, no longer a misunderstanding. This was the moment authority demanded to be confirmed through action. Miller hesitated for a split second. Then he nodded. Yes, sir. He turned to Evelyn, his voice lower. Ma'am, please. Evelyn looked at Miller. Just a brief glance. No reproach. No pleading. That look carried something Miller couldn't quite name, not defiance, but experience. He had seen that look before in seasoned soldiers. Those who knew there were battles you didn't fight right away. Evelyn didn't move, not to challenge the order, but because she understood this moment would be remembered in some way, not for what she said, but for how others treated her. Kane took the hesitation as provocation. Didn't you hear me? He said louder. Out! Now! His voice carried farther than necessary, far enough for the entire motor pool to hear, far enough to turn a conversation into public humiliation. Some people looked away. Others stared curious. No one intervened. In that moment, Evelyn stood alone, not because she didn't belong there, but because no one yet dared to stand beside her. She remained silent, not because she lacked an answer, but because the real answer hadn't reached its time to be spoken. The silence stretched on. Kane believed he had won, but somewhere between eyes beginning to shift and breaths slowing, something was moving, slowly but irreversibly. And when power believes it has pushed a person beyond the final boundary, that is precisely when procedure begins to speak. Miller stood before Evelyn for another beat. The hesitation in him didn't disappear, but the procedure was still there. He drew a short breath. Ma'am, I need to see your identification. His voice wasn't loud. It wasn't threatening. It was simply a sentence drilled into him from his earliest days in uniform, when he was taught that verification always comes before judgment. Evelyn nodded almost imperceptibly. She reached into her bag and produced a plain card. No flourish, no ostentatious symbols. She placed it in Miller's hand. Follow the procedure, she said calmly. No further explanation, no emphasis on anything else. Miller checked the card. One beat, then another. He tried again. The result was the same. He looked up, slightly unsettled. It won't scan, he said, turning toward Kane. The system requires a higher clearance. Kane crossed his arms, tapping the toe of his boot against the ground. Of course it won't scan, he said dismissively. It's a fake, or some contractor badge. He stepped forward, snatched the card from Miller's hand, and glanced at it as if his eyes alone were enough to pass judgment. This has no value here. Evelyn didn't argue. She spoke only one sentence, short and precise. Your system isn't authorized to read that card. Kane scoffed. Don't lecture me about my own system. He lifted his head, his voice turning cold. Listen, Kane said, loud enough for everyone to hear. You are in a restricted military area without authorization. From this moment on, you are considered trespassing. He turned to Miller. If she doesn't leave immediately, call the MPs. Miller froze. He looked at Evelyn, then at Kane. In that moment, procedure and command stood face to face. Sir, he began, then stopped. Evelyn spoke only the second time since everything began. Her voice wasn't raised, but it cut cleanly through the tension. Check your calendar, she said. My name is on that directive. One sentence. Nothing more. No explanation. No defense. Kane stared at her as if he'd just heard a personal insult. What are you talking about? He snapped. Who do you think you are? He turned to the crowd, his voice louder now. She's impersonating federal authority. He pointed at Evelyn. Stolen valor, Kane said, each word dropping heavily, carrying meaningless trinkets, speaking like an officer, but with nothing to back it up. The accusation didn't just dismiss Evelyn's words, it stripped her of dignity in front of everyone. Evelyn remained still. Her expression didn't change. She didn't step back. She had heard accusations like this before, in places where the truth needed time to arrive. Her composure wasn't acceptance. It was control of the moment, so it wouldn't devolve into a pointless argument. Miller clenched his fist. He knew the procedure wasn't complete. He also knew he was standing at a point of no return. Kane had said the word MPs. Once that word was spoken, everything would move in a different direction. Kane made his final decision. Call them, he said. Handle this properly. At that moment, power no longer resided in the loudest voice. It began to slide slowly, but unmistakably from noise to facts that hadn't yet been verified. The eyes around them no longer followed Kane with the same certainty. Some began to recall old lessons that true authority rarely needs to shout. Evelyn drew a soft breath in. No one noticed. She knew she had just placed a marker not with her identity, not with her rank, but with a brief reminder of what the military is built upon: procedure, discipline, and truth. When noise reaches its limit, silent symbols begin to speak. Evelyn didn't respond to the accusation. She didn't look at Kane. She didn't look at Miller either. Her left hand slowly emerged from her jacket pocket, carrying something small but heavy. The coin rested in her palm, its surface worn smooth, its edges slightly chipped, as if it had been gripped too tightly, too many times. There were no flashy markings, no shine, just metal shaped by time. Kane noticed the movement immediately. What's that now? He said, his voice thick with disdain. A souvenir, he scoffed. They sell those everywhere in gift shops. You think carrying one makes you an officer? Evelyn gently closed her fingers around the coin. She didn't raise it. She didn't display it. She held it the way someone holds a promise. In that moment, the surrounding sounds receded, making room for memory to surface. Not loudly, not fully formed, but in fragments sharp enough to cut deep. A night flight. The helicopter cabin shuddering in the wind, the eyes of the soldiers facing her silent but trusting. A mission with no margin for error. A decision made in seconds amid chaos and broken signals. And when it was over, when they all came back whole, a calloused hand placed this very coin into hers. No praise, no speech. Just a short sentence: you brought us home. The coin wasn't a reward. It was a marker. An acknowledgement from a world where honor doesn't need to be spoken aloud. A world Kane had never entered and perhaps never would. Put that meaningless thing away, Kane said again, his voice sharper now. It proves nothing. To him, the coin was just an object. No history, no weight, no memory. But not everyone saw it that way. At the edge of the motor pool, Command Sergeant Major Lewis had been standing there for some time. He didn't step forward. He didn't intervene. He simply observed. Lewis had served long enough to know that some things don't need explanation. His gaze settled on Evelyn's hand, then on the coin. One beat. Then another. He recognized it. Not by its shape, but by the feeling. Lewis had seen coins like that before in sealed rooms on desks belonging to men whose names never appeared in reports. He remembered evenings after missions when coins were passed, not to boast, but to remember that someone had carried the hardest part for everyone else. Lewis drew a slow breath in. His back straightened. His hand tightened slightly around an oily rag. He didn't look at Kane. He looked at Evelyn. No salute. No words. But in his eyes was a silent confirmation, like a nod only those who had been there would understand. The system began to move from a place no one was watching. Miller sensed the change first. Not logically, but instinctively. The air was different now. The eyes around them no longer fixed on Kane with the same certainty. Some began to look at Lewis, then back at Evelyn. No one spoke. But the silence was no longer complicit. It was expectant. Kane still stood there, convinced he held control. "I don't care what you're holding," he said, as if to reassert his authority. "It doesn't change the fact that you don't belong here." Evelyn lifted her head, looking directly at Kane for the first time since everything had escalated. "You're right," she said, her voice low and steady. "It isn't meant to persuade." She opened her hand once more, then closed it. "It's meant to remind me why I don't need to." Lewis turned away quietly and reached for his phone. Not hurried, not secretive. Just the familiar motion of someone who understands that when a symbol appears, the real process begins. And when someone understands that the truth doesn't arrive through raised voices, it arrives through the unavoidable presence of true authority. Lewis said nothing as he made the call. He simply lifted the phone to his ear and turned slightly away, as if every movement needed to remain within strict discipline. "This is Lewis," he said briefly. "We have an urgent situation at the motor pool." He paused for a beat, then continued, his voice low but firm. "Yes, it's her. That was all." No further explanation. When Lewis ended the call, he stood still. He gave no signal. He looked at no one. Yet the certainty in his posture was enough for those nearby to sense that the gears had begun to turn. Miller glanced at Lewis, then at Evelyn, then at Kane. He said nothing. The waiting spread like a wave of silence. Kane kept his rigid tone. "I don't need any more delays," he said. "Call the MPs." He turned halfway as if to reinforce his order. But this time no one responded immediately. Eyes had shifted. They no longer centered on Kane the way they had before. Then the command vehicles arrived. Not loudly, not with display, just enough for everyone to understand that higher authority was now present. Kane turned back, irritation still on his face. He was about to speak, then stopped. Major General Daniel Cross stepped out his stride, straight and unhurried. He didn't look at Kane. He didn't ask questions. He didn't seek clarification. His eyes went straight to Evelyn, as if everything else were merely background. Lewis snapped to attention. Miller did the same. The others followed by reflex drilled into them long ago. Cross stopped in front of Evelyn. He straightened and slowly raised his hand in salute. "Brigadier General Evelyn Hart," he said, his voice carrying clearly without emphasis. The way he addressed her answered every remaining doubt. Evelyn returned the salute. No raised voice. No excess expression. Just a precise formal motion, as if this had been inevitable from the start. In that instant, every whisper disappeared. Her identity was confirmed through action, no further explanation required. Cross lowered his hand and turned slightly toward those standing nearby. "For clarity," he said calmly, "this is Brigadier General Evelyn Hart." He didn't recite a list. He didn't embellish. Only the necessary truths. She previously oversaw logistical coordination under conditions most of us only read about in reports. A beat. She was responsible for decisions that brought our people home safely. Kane stood frozen. The color drained from his face so quickly, he didn't even register it. He opened his mouth, then closed it. The authority he believed he held had slipped from his grasp, not because it was taken from him, but because it had never belonged to him in this moment. Cross turned to Kane for the first time. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't shout. "Colonel," he said, his tone cold and precise. "You have committed a serious error." He said nothing more. He didn't need to. The silence that followed was enough to define the consequences. Miller looked at Kane, then at Evelyn. He understood what he had sensed from the beginning. Some people carry authority not because of visible rank, but because of the responsibility they have borne. Lewis stood there, his gaze never leaving Evelyn. He didn't smile. There was no need. His confirmation had come long before Cross arrived. Cross turned back to Evelyn. "Brigadier General," he said, his voice lowering slightly, "this installation is under your authority for inspection." Evelyn nodded. Thank you, she replied. 2 words. Enough. No one applauded. No one cheered. Respect didn't require sound now. It lived in the way people stood still and how their eyes looked away and then returned with new caution. Kane remained motionless, as if staring at a different version of himself in the mirror, one no longer shielded by assumptions or a loud voice. Evelyn's identity wasn't announced through a long story. It was confirmed through ritual, through the recognition of true authority by true authority. And in that moment, the motor pool understood they had witnessed something rare, the truth entering a room without needing to knock. And once the truth had taken its rightful place, the lesson was no longer for the one who had been insulted, but for the one who had caused it. Kane stood still. His shoulders sagged ever so slightly, as if the full weight of his wrong assumptions had just settled onto his back. He didn't say another word, not because there was nothing left to say, but because any justification now had become meaningless. His gaze dropped, not in search of sympathy, but as the instinctive reaction of someone who had just realized he had lost the right to stand tall. Major General Cross turned to Kane. His voice wasn't loud, wasn't sharp, and carried no personal emotion. Colonel, he said each word falling with clarity. You did not fail because you lacked authority. You failed because you ignored the standard. Cross paused for a beat. Procedure exists to protect us from our own assumptions. Today, you chose assumption. Kane swallowed hard. Sir. Cross raised a hand to stop him. No explanations, he said. Explanations don't correct mistakes. Only what follows does. The air around them thickened. Those standing nearby no longer looked at Kane with curiosity. They looked at him the way one looks at a lesson taking shape. No one laughed. No one whispered. The silence was no longer complicit. It was receptive. Evelyn stepped forward half a pace, not to claim the floor, only to reset the focus. She looked at Kane, then at Cross, then at the people standing around them. When she spoke, her voice carried no judgment. Your rank is visible on your chest, she said slowly, but your character is not. She paused, allowing the words time to reach each person. Character is revealed by how you handle what you don't know, not by what you think you know. Kane lifted his head. He didn't respond. He listened. Evelyn continued, her tone unchanged. This military is not built on instinct. It is built on procedure. A beat. Verify first. Trust procedure, not assumption. Cross gave a slight nod. That is the standard, he said, reinforcing the point. And that standard applies to all of us. Miller stood nearby, his hand clenched tight. He understood that this lesson wasn't meant only for Kane. It was meant for him, for those still learning what authority truly is. Not the louder voice, not the faster command, but the ability to pause and check oneself. Evelyn turned to the crowd. No one here needs to be publicly punished, she said. What matters is that you remember this moment. She looked at each face. Remember how heavy silence can become. Remember that a single wrong assumption can damage the honor of an entire unit. Kane bowed his head. Not deeply, not dramatically. Just enough to show that he understood not intellectually, but through the necessary shame that makes change possible. Cross concluded simply. We move on, he said, and we do it right. No one applauded. No one exhaled in relief. The silence lingered for a moment longer, then settled like water after a ripple. Honor is not restored by humiliating the one who is wrong. It is restored by calmly resetting the standard. Evelyn stepped back one pace, returning the center to the system. That was how she had always done it. She didn't claim the attention. She didn't hold the moment. She left the lesson where it belonged. When words are enough to correct a mistake, the legacy no longer lies in that moment, but in how the system changes afterward. The decision was issued swiftly and decisively. Colonel Kane was temporarily relieved of command pending a formal investigation. There was no loud announcement, no public justification. Just a brief entry in the system, yet enough to affirm that the mistake made that day would not be ignored nor shielded by rank or seniority. A few days later, a new procedure was circulated throughout the base. Its language was concise, unadorned. Verify before you judge. Not as a slogan, but as a mandatory requirement. Any situation involving authority credentials or identity now had to pass through proper verification. The directive didn't mention Evelyn by name, but everyone who read it knew why it existed. The base returned to its usual rhythm. Vehicles moved in and out, orders were issued, reports were signed. Yet a subtle change could be felt everywhere. People paused half a beat longer before giving commands. They slowed down to verify. They slowed down to make sure they weren't mistaking a person for an appearance. Several weeks later, in an ordinary setting, Kane appeared again. No uniform, no insignia, no rank. He wore civilian clothes, his posture slightly closed, as if for the first time in many years he had to stand before others without authority beside him. He saw Evelyn first, but didn't approach immediately. He waited. When she turned, he gave a small nod. Ma'am Kane said, his voice low and brief. "I didn't come to make excuses." He paused, then continued slowly. "I only came to apologize. In person." Evelyn looked at him. Not searching, not cold, not comforting either. She nodded in acknowledgement. "I've heard you," she said. Then she added her tone even without weight or judgment. "Don't let your last mistake define your next chapter." Kane drew a deep breath. He didn't thank her. He didn't offer further explanation. He simply nodded again, like someone who had just heard what he needed most, even if it wasn't what he wanted most. When he turned away, his back was no longer as straight as before, but his steps were steadier. Evelyn didn't remain at the center of anything. She completed her assignment, signed the report, and left the base the same way she had arrived. No ceremony, no farewell. She returned to her familiar role, a quiet servant, where responsibility matters more than recognition. Before leaving, she lightly touched her jacket pocket. The coin was still there. It wasn't taken out. It didn't need to be seen. It had fulfilled its purpose. It wasn't meant to prove anything. It was meant to remind. And when no one needed reminding anymore, it returned to its rightful place beside memory and promise. Those who remained went back to their work. But the story didn't disappear. It was retold in lower voices, in reminders to check more carefully, in the way a young lieutenant paused to ask for credentials before giving an order, in the way an older officer stayed silent a moment longer before reaching a conclusion. Legacy does not live in the moment someone is exposed. Legacy lives in how an entire system learns to respect the right person at the right time. Legacy is not a rank that makes others bow. Legacy is how we teach those who come after us to show respect to the right person at the right time. Veterans' legacy stories. We remember the quiet heroes. If this story makes you believe that honor and kindness never retire, please share this video, and subscribe to Veterans' Legacy Stories so that no memory of theirs is ever forgotten.